All right, good morning, everyone, and for joining us this morning. Mike Jorgensen with the Center for Consumer Products. And doing the presentation this morning is Bob Smith, our data analyst and the individual who puts the report together each month and does these webinars. So, Bob, I'll let you get going.
All right. Um, I just, I think if you've been reading the report, I have in every report the phrase creating a context in which other people can think. And I do that because I put out a lot of different information. I don't know your company. I don't know who your suppliers are, who your customers are. So I hope I touch on some information that'll let you think about your business and how this may apply. Um, most of the presentation today has to do with forecast by international groups, forecast by our federal government and other people making comments about them and how accurate they find those. But first, just take a quick look at some of the current news. Um, in the economic consumer price index, came out on May 19th. The June report, of course, isn't out yet. But what you saw is consumer price increase went up 2.8%. But what I find interesting is that in there and looking at it, gasoline at 28.6, yet there wasn't this huge increase in CPI, which obviously had to mean that food, which was usually around a 5%, showed a smaller increase, as well as most of the goods, durable and semi durable. Also, the Bank of Canada left the target rate unchanged at 2.25%. This was similar. The Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, and Bank of England all held their policy rates. And I've started putting in the presentation going, so what? So no change can be significant, especially when one kicks out like gasoline. And the other what is showing is there hasn't been a significant pass through of the cost of diesel and gasoline. Other economic news: our the trade surplus was 1.78, which always is dependent on the oil sales to the U.S. But export motor vehicles were up 4.5. I think maybe I need to look a closer look at that because that's been fairly consistent, yet everything in the news seems to be negative. Imports were down 1.6. Consumer goods imports were down 3.9. But the total imports for the first quarter of 2026 were up 4.6. So things are kind of all over the place. In employment, there was some doom and gloom media reporting about it, but employment was essentially flat in April at 18,000 jobs. The average hourly wage among employees was 4.5 year over year. There was a specific report come out by Stats Canada, which showed construction costs for Q1 2026. Residential building prices were up 2.8. Non-residential costs were up 3.6. Now you can look at it and say, oh, well, that's significant, and in many ways it is. But construction cost increases are basically in line with CPI and below wage growth. And wages are included in the construction costs. So what? Wages are growing faster than CPI inflation. Mhm. And I use the phrase CPI inflation, which means it's just CPI. If you looked at the wage growth, then kind of questionable whether it's inflation. And construction costs, including labor, in line with CPI. Nothing great to report, but nothing that negative to report either. You probably have seen the news and they're talking technical recession and so forth. So I thought I added this slide a couple of days ago. So real gross real gross domestic product fell 0.1. That comes after a revised contraction of 0.6. Stats Canada always revises the next month after of what the previous month was. And you'll probably see later on is why that is. There's just so much information. Um, so you look at the technical and so forth, right? And we'll get into a few details in there. But recession, based on the International Monetary Fund, a recession is usually associated with a decline of 2%. In cases severe, it would be 5%. Flash estimate from Statistics Canada, April, they're looking at a likely GDP likely grew by 0.4. I do like this comment, which is not bad meaning bad, but bad meaning good. Is who knows what it means? Maybe nothing, maybe something significant. But anyway, I thought I had to mention that as I'm going to be talking about GDP later on. So the main push of the report was kind of looking at risk, and I remember only a few short years ago, buyers were fixated on product costs. Today, the conversation is dominated by logistics costs, fuel prices, tariffs, and global political uncertainty. If you could think, and a few short years, it could be 3 to 5 years ago, it almost seemed like an easy job to be a buyer. Now you have to be a guru of all sorts of things. But buyers now ask, what's my exposure? How do I hedge? What's my worst case scenario? And when dealing with foreign suppliers, you need to understand their economic environment. It's not Canada, and it's not Canada's economics. So when we look at economic indicators, they are not abstract. They are aggregate impact of the same pressures buyers feel every day. They're almost like a conclusion or a shorthand to what's going on. I'll quickly go through a number of these. We can ask questions later. So the government of Canada came up and did an update. And what I wanted to do is more compare it against other people and what their forecasting was. So they came up with GDP of 1.1 in 26 and higher in 2027, though it's not up around the 3 or 4% every country wish they had. Bank of Canada basically agree, but a little lower in 27. International Monetary Fund, again, 27 looked better. OECD, economic development, 1.2, 1.7, and the Parliamentary Budget Office a bit higher, but they're all within the same amount. And that's not by chance. Governments do go out and they check all these things before they do an update or before they do a budget. so that they can't be criticized of predicting unsubstantiated growth. And one of the ways they do it is they have a private sector group, and most of the group is made up of the Canadian banks and other financial institutions, but they're also large companies. And they come out with what their forecast is. So real GDP better in 26 and 25. Unemployment is worse. CPI inflation is a bit worse. Bank of Canada policy rate, everybody looks at it being flat. And the exchange rate is not getting any better and possibly worse. So the private sector generally agrees with what the federal government put out. And I always looked at it, and I apologize if you have an economics degree or whatever, but I had one person is in university, they said if they wanted us to go to the economics class, why do they have them so early? They were usually the 8 o'clock. But just want to point out a few things and then move on. GDP is based on consumption. At least these numbers are. There's other ways to calculate it, but few people use them anymore, which is consumption. You can look at retail sales is in there. Investments by the government, investments by corporations and so forth. Government spending, but it excludes things like EI, pension, and so forth. And net exports, which is total exports minus total imports. So they all come in. Many of you are in the wholesale trade, and it is included in GDP, but it is included only through its value add, not through resale value of the goods themselves. So it's basically cost of goods sold less cost of goods purchased. So it's on the net. And I'm doing this so we get onto the same page before everybody can predict what the economics are going to happen around the world. So GDP, as most everybody knows, GDP goes up, it hits inflation, inflation goes up because prices start going up, labor demand goes up. The central bank or government jump in and they increase the rates to cool down inflation. And cooling down with interest rates going up, the exchange rate improves. Aging myself, working in trading, bank trading rooms, is they used to have people who would sit there and they see the money market moving and the exchange rate isn't moving. And in fact, one person would stand up and start yelling, arbitrage, 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 which means the FX guy better start buying or selling based on these are not in balance. So anyway, exchange rate goes up, interest rates go down, capital flows, particularly in the banking sector, start moving into the currency. And here, just looking at it, and I think everybody has picked up that all of these different economic indicators are all tied to each other. And if they don't stay within a certain range of each other, then there are certain arbitrage traders who will take advantage of that and start buying or selling. So we kind of looked at Canada, and it is what it is, but everybody kind of agrees on that. Now, the International Monetary Fund, which is a very broad group of companies, these numbers were in there, but their comment, which came out at the start of April, is assuming the conflict remains limited in duration and scope, global growth is projected at 3.1 and 3.2%. Global headline inflation projected to rise modestly in 26 before resuming its decline in 2027. Whoops, there's a spelling. Where instead of war in Iran. As long as the shock itself remains modest, this suggests possibly more subdued inflation impact than COVID caused and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So they looked at a bit modest.
Bob, sorry to interrupt. Are you meant to be sharing your slides right now?
Yes.
Okay. You're not. Or at least I'm not seeing it. Is anyone else seeing it?
I'm seeing it
Oh,
fine.
sorry, I was on a wrong tab on my Zoom. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
I'll read the numbers 2.3, 2.3, 6.
I got it. I got it. No, I was on a different tab on my Zoom. Sorry about that, guys.
No problem at all. I imagine how you do this before you had webinars and you had to talk the whole thing. So anyway, just kind of pointing out some in the IMF, as you can see, the Eurozone in GDP. But one of the points I wanted to point out is that everybody, even the Eurozone and the companies within that group, the economic indicators vary considerably. Germany, low deficit, CPI, kind of neutral. France, quite a high deficit percentage, which I think everybody know, as well as Italy. Both governments are spending and borrowing quite heavily, as is Japan. China is interesting because China has something like $1 trillion in reserve, but this number is just the year, what they take in taxes and what they are spending. They don't really have to finance it. They have reserves to cover it. So anyway. But what we're heading is putting these two pieces together. What I talked about before about GDP going up and so forth, and what the cycle running around is of course the opposite is true as well. If GDP is going down, then you hit into inflation, exchange rates, interest rates, and inflation drop. All right. So this is the same numbers as we had in the previous sheet. But what I'm saying, GDP going up, but GDP going down affects everything again in the opposite. You look at Japan, it's quite low as well. So that's kind of looking at it. What I tried to do then is I did OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation Development. Now there's only 38 members, and the main reason because that there's only 38 countries where numbers are available and fairly reliable. So what does it mean in a way for you as a business when you're looking at a country or you see that one of your trading partners or suppliers are in one of these countries? So if there is demand strength, GDP is going up. You get into rising wage demands, upward inflation pressure, especially if demand grows faster than productive capacity, higher import demand, but also a potential for cost push inflation, which means if they're having a high inflation and you are buying from there, they will try and push that inflation on you. So knowing whether they have high or low inflation is often critical if they come in and say, oh, our prices are going up because of inflation. You look at it and say, no, your inflation is normal. Okay. That that doesn't support you demanding a higher cost or higher price. Of course, a higher demand for Canadian. If there is weak GDP, which many of them have, there is lower wage pressure, reduced inflation risk, which is, the opposite. There can be a higher FX volatility. Currency could depreciate. So you have to think about FX and hedging. A more aggressive procurement behavior from the buyer. In that case, it's going down, and they may be very aggressive, okay, on pricing. And kind of looking at the different ones, you see here in Euro, I keep looking at the European countries, and we often look at them and say, oh, they're all the same. And well, they certainly aren't. Germany is looking at 0.4 GDP growth in 25. They had in 25. They're looking at 0.8 in 26. 27, everybody seems to be more optimistic in 27. But France, if you look at it, is still fairly low. And you can look at the previous slide where we showed that they've got a lot of debt. They have quite a large deficit. And most of that's due to their pension program, which they tried to modify but end up with riots all over the place. Italy is kind of limping along. Well, Spain is doing not too bad. We talked about China. India, quite a high GDP growth. And what's coming out is that there is a fair increase in domestic demand for products. So you maybe, if you're dealing with India, see some kind of push because this type of growth in GDP is going to hit inflation. And they'll want higher prices. Indonesia as well. And this is all going back is to kind of look at the environment, the national environment of your suppliers to get an overall feel of the pressures they may be under. OECD also puts out inflation numbers. So when you're looking at it, Turkey is really having a problem here, but inflation under 3%, under 2% really isn't that bad. But as it kind of rises, you realize that there is going to be some labor demands for increased wages. Right? So if it's a high inflation in a partner country, of course, face rising wages. They will push for price increases, even try and look at surcharges on short-term contracts. They'll try and pass through those increased demands. So if there's high inflation in the country you're dealing with, you can expect them to move. Currencies, high inflations, currencies depreciate, so there's the risk there. And so what we're saying is greater need for contract indexation, which means basically set up and prices may grow or decline based on inflation. Now, if they have low inflation, you usually have a predictable cost. Currency is usually stable. and weaker supplier arguments for price increases. Let's look at, and I'll throw in another twist. And really, in many ways, I'm just trying to get your attention and understand that many of your suppliers, I remember when I was working in Asia, people were going, oh, well, I'm getting all these great prices and so forth. And they asked me, our Canadian customers asked me to take a look at a few companies in Malaysia. And I kept telling them, and this may be in Mexico, is saying, you may have this great contract, but these guys will close down in a heartbeat. They'll be gone in 2 days and you'll never be able to find that supplier again. They'll probably open up, a mile down the road, but now you're dealing with a new entity. So it's very good to understand your supplier and what their financial position is, because they can, if they don't like the contract, they'll move, they'll close down. But Mexico, for instance, looking at what actually happens, and you can look at it and say, okay, everything is hit by the oil crisis or the war in Iran or Kuzma. But there are long-term issues that remain unresolved in Mexico if that is one of your suppliers. Structural weaknesses affecting supply reliability, chronic underinvestment in infrastructure. And what you're looking at, we'll talk, their electricity grid, I understand, is falling apart. Their oil, government oil company hasn't invested anything. Of course, the rule of law, which we've all seen, and security issues, electricity grid that I just had, and soft confidence in there. And as I was saying about when I was in Asia and looking at Malaysia at the time, okay, supplier reliability varies widely. Excuse me. Due diligence and dual sourcing, which should be mandatory. So we can look at it and say, okay, globally, we know kind of what's happening. The price of oil is affecting X, Y, and Z, and so on and so forth. But every country has other national problems. And buyers, I guess I'm looking at putting a lot on there, is need to be aware of what's going on economically. And what is normal? Mexico has economic problems even after Kuzma is put together, after the oil prices regularized and so forth. There's still problems there. And you need to handle any company in there as it was. But if we looked at Mexico, it's only normal we should take a look at Canada as well. And what certainly Carney and the government have been talking about capital investment, but Canada is not in the top 5, though it is part of the advanced economies group for attracting capital. It excels in certainty, rule of law, market access, but faces structural challenges in cost, productivity, and permitting speed. Remember, even if you're an importer and you sell into the retail market, you're part of that economy. Okay, you really can't say, oh, well, I'm not an exporter. So no, okay, you're part of the whole economy, and the economy will affect your business no matter what. Okay, what type of business you're in. Canada has a productivity challenge, and it lags its peer countries. Weak business investment, to GDP limits long-term competitiveness. Our companies that we do have are not that productive. Electricity grid constraints, and that has to do with a lot of interprovincial regulations and so forth. They're working on it, but not very quickly. And there still is port congestion, rail bottlenecks affecting supply chain reliability. I did a report a while ago where I looked at rail, and rail seems to work great if you're talking about oil or wheat, but if you're talking about anything else, they're kind of second priorities. And of course, we have CUSMA sitting there over our head until we hopefully clear that up or get some answers to that. But when you look at investments, you're looking at corporations making their investments. Of course, they have billions of dollars, and the government doesn't want to be out there putting all the investment in. But I think many have looked at why are Canadian base oil prices, which includes refinery, higher than many countries that have no oil. And it's easy to jump around because there's so much politics and everything, but really it's companies and how they look at investment firms. This chart, I don't know if it caught a lot of people's attention, but the base oil price, if you look at Canada, this was in the early January, February, where the last time it came out, is base oil price $1.62 in Canada. And you sit down, you go down, you look at Netherlands is $1.39. You kind of scratch your head and say, so why are the base oil prices in Canada higher than in countries that don't even have oil? Because this includes the cost of oil and the refining costs. Finland, 172. And you look at how low this is. Now, we've always, I think, thought about it and said, gasoline costs more in Europe. But this is the tax load that's added on to it. Some of them, certainly the Netherlands, is higher than the base price for oil and refinery. And you can go down the list. Canada is fairly low in taxes on gasoline and diesel. But you look at the other countries, and yes, the total price is higher, but it's base oil price you look at and say, how can Portugal have a cost of $1.28? They have no oil. Even Greece is lower than Canada. And what I pointed out, it's not taxes, it's not supply or reserves, it's structure. Right? Canada, in many ways, is split in two. We have heavy oil in the west, is what the refineries push through, and light crude in the east. So this is showing you have heavy crude, it's going through Edmonton, Regina refineries, as is the Burnaby, BC, and being exported. Here in Eastern Canada is we import U.S. light crude into Sarnia, and it moves by pipeline to Montreal. And these factories are set up only to handle U.S. light crude. It's always been the practice. It was the most economical, and that's why the petroleum companies invested and built those type of refineries. So you have Newfoundland offshore. They export light crude to Europe. And everyone I've talked to who hasn't followed this is that Irving Oil, which has the largest refinery in Canada, imports light crude from Saudi Arabia. And you kind of shake your head and look at it. But shrinking domestic gasoline demand removes the incentive for companies to expand or increase efficiency. So the large oil companies aren't going to start rebuilding their refineries and building out new pipelines to bring in heavy crude from Western Canada. Increasing efficiency and adding pipelines to use heavy crude would require an estimated $70 to $100 billion and take 10 to 20 years to complete. I don't know any company who would be prepared to invest in pricing and operations in a market that is dropping. We use less fuel, less diesel and gasoline almost every year. So in a way, when you look at it, and it's funny because we hear all these things, or I look at on TV, on news shows by politicians, and these are two separate markets. There's the international oil market, which Canada sells in. Europe and Asia, most of their refineries are certainly newer than Canadian refineries, and they can handle both. They can handle light crude and heavy crude. But Canadian domestic refining system is essentially right-sized for a shrinking fuel market. Right? The system isn't broken. It's economically rational for a country with modest population density, long distance, and declining gas and diesel demand. Even if Canada became a global energy superpower through its resource base, domestic fuel markets are shaped far more than domestic market size than by the volume of oil reserves. So it's a lot like I was saying before, of looking at the economics in the individual country and kind of look at and just logically and basically say, is this market growing? If it's going down, is there going to be higher inflation and so forth? And how does that going to impact my business? So for Canada is looking ahead in these parts, Canada's national energy future will be driven less by refining capacity and more by nuclear power, electrification, and rapid adoption of electric vehicles, because nobody is going to want to go out there and spend $100 billion, which is going to take 10 years to update. So it's use your business sense to kind of look at and say, what would I do in this country or that country, or in this business, and so forth. So a lot of this in this process is planning. Now, a lot of the report was trying to look at international economics and using kind of the high-level economic forecast. So June, kind of go back. I'll be going back into retail trade, looking at general merchandise retailers, which for some reason, and I'll try and find out, dropped last month. Building and material, garden equipment dealers, and e-commerce. Look at foreign exchange over multiple currencies. When you look at that, foreign exchange rate is really a very quick indicator of what's going on in the country. And if the exchange rate's going up or down, you may want to look and take a better look or a more in-depth look at what's going on in the country if that's one of your trading partners. Take a look at commercial rent, warehousing costs in Canada, which then also drops down that there was a number of special reports and analysis on third-party logistic costs in Canada. So we'll break down those next month. So I've covered a lot of area, but it's more to get the attention and so forth. Mike will be adding to the library this presentation as well as the video, and people are contact me if you have questions. But these are big sides, and I wanted to take a look at it and say there's so much to look at, and hard to make decisions without having very specific of what your business is. So anyway, questions. I will try and answer them. I was one in university who didn't get up that early and go to economics class, but I will try and answer.
There was classes that started at 8 a.m., Bob? I didn't know that.
Yeah. You kind of had to fold the top of the list, okay, and take out all those 8 o'clock. They also had most of the heavy math classes at 8 o'clock in the morning.
So yeah, as Bob was mentioning, we post all the reports that Bob puts out and copies of the presentation decks and the actual recordings if we record a webinar. They're posted on our website, and there's a resource library. It's member protected, so there is a password that's required. So basically, you can email myself, and I'll send you the password, or you can just email me. And if you're having any difficulty getting the information from the website. So I think the next report is probably the June report is going to be out in probably the week of June 15th, I believe. And our next,
I try and the 15th, around the 15th of the month is when Stats Canada comes out with new numbers from the previous month. So I try to hold off for two reasons. One, so I can provide the latest numbers, and the other one is that I haven't said something that they contradict. Bob said it's going up, but it went down. What kind of fool is he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So depending on when we get the report out, most likely the next webinar will be on Friday, the 26th of June. Assuming, Bob, you're available then.
Yeah. But look at it. I've already looked at some of the costs that are going to be in here. Warehousing costs are interesting, but it's always in the detail. It's not everywhere. All right. So it's always a kind of combination is, where should I warehouse? Where are the 3PL costs the highest and the lowest? And what does it cost to move merchandise between those warehouses? So,
yeah, I'm not sure you can answer this, Bob, but given the performance of the Canadian economy, the start of the year, do you think it's below what they were initially forecasting, and therefore is the year-end forecast really reliable at this point?
I would think so because those forecasts came out very recently, and they came out under the conditions haven't changed much since they came out. They were done in April and into May. So those are still valid forecasts. And keeping in mind, Q1 is usually pretty slow.
Yeah.
Okay, retail slow. Everybody's trying to pay off their Christmas credit cards, etc. So yeah, I would say they are still valid. The IMF and OECD came out very recently. They do 6-month updates, and that was their update they did in 1st of May, I think they came out. So
Okay, I'll hold you to it.
not me. They've got thousands of economists in there.
I know, but you're on the webinar now, so that's who we're gonna.
I used to
Hold it,
laugh as the IMF. I had some problems in Asia. I had some bad debts by employees of the IMF that we had a hard time collecting. So they may be great economists. They don't manage their own bank accounts very well.
All right. Well, if there's not any other questions, then thanks again, Bob, for all the great information you presented, and thank you for joining us this morning. And have a great Friday and weekend, and we'll see you guys hopefully on a call down the road. So take care, everyone.
Thanks, Michael.
Cheers.
Thanks,
Thank
Bob.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks,
Thanks
Michael.
for
Thanks,
tuning
Bob.
in.
Excellent
Thank
presentation.
you.
Bye.